Om Tavakatamritam Taptajivanam Kalpirititam Kalmashapam Sharavanamangalam Shrimadatatam Bhuvangiranantiye Burita Janaha. The nectar of your words, the praise of poet-seers, elixir to parched souls, delight to listening ears, cleanser of all sins is great and glorious. They who spread it far and wide on earth are most generous. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good evening, friends. We are continuing with the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And if you're following along in the book, we are still on page 168 near the top. So Ramakrishna is speaking to Vijay. He says to Vijay, "Come here now and then. I like to see you very much." Well, Vijay was a hired priest at the Brahmo Samaj, and he had developed a close relationship to Sri Ramakrishna, as did many of the young devotees that attended the Brahmo Samaj. And they were, because Sri Ramakrishna often visited them to their services, many of them were attracted by him and his teachings. So they would come to the Dakineshar and visit him. So Vijay replied, "I have to do my various duties at the Brahmo Samaj. That is why I cannot always come here, but I shall visit you whenever I find it possible." So Master to Vijay, the task of a religious teacher is indeed difficult. One cannot teach men without a direct command from God. People won't listen to you if you teach without such authority. Such teaching has no force behind it. One must first of all attain God through spiritual discipline or some other means. Thus, armed with authority from God, one can deliver lectures. So Sri Ramakrishna, speaking to Vijay, he was hired there. He wasn't giving lectures because of some act of God or because he had realized God or received any command from God to give those talks. So Sri Ramakrishna is talking to him in this vein. And he says that one must first of all attain God through spiritual discipline or some other means. Now we have no doubt that Vijay he practiced spiritual disciplines, but he had not realized God in that sense. So he was hired to do that service. But then Sri Ramakrishna also mentions that one must first attain God through spiritual discipline or some other means. Well, by some other means, he's talking about either you have realized God by the grace of God, either through prayer or austerity, or you've received the grace of a divine incarnation, something that didn't require as much effort as going through a lifetime of spiritual discipline. Or you perhaps did a lot of spiritual practices in a previous life and only had a small amount left in this life. So that's what he would mean by some other means. Then he continues, after receiving the command from God, one can be a teacher and give lectures anywhere. He who receives authority from God also receives power from him. Only then can he perform the difficult task of a teacher. So we as sannyasis, we regard the Ramakrishna order as the body of Sri Ramakrishna. And sometimes our seniors will ask the juniors to give lectures and talks. So we regard that in a way as permission to give talks by Sri Ramakrishna. So, but we do it not because we feel that we are teachers, but we do it as an act of service to Sri Ramakrishna. So, but we do that keeping in mind that Sri Ramakrishna is the teacher and we are only his servants. We are trying to disseminate his teachings and make them somewhat understandable. And some swamis will be more successful than others. So that's how I see my role here. So, but Sri Ramakrishna also regarded any pundit or teacher or spiritual, any teacher of the scriptures, he regarded them as straw if they did not also do spiritual practices and have spiritual experience and realizations coinciding with their teachings. Because in a way, it's a case of practicing what you preach, or one's actions speak louder than one's words. Your life has to follow your teachings. And if one's thoughts and one's words and one's actions all coincide, then those words have power. Because that's like the full force of your spiritual practices, the full force of your actions, all with that intent of realizing God. So when you speak that way, the audience feels the power of those words. So just as when Swami Vivekananda stood up and addressed the audience at the World Parliament of Religions, all he said was, "Sisters and brothers of America," and everyone started clapping and cheering. Well, and they didn't do that for any of the other speakers. So here we have a case of a person, Swami Vivekananda, whose whole life was put into those words, because he sincerely believed that every human being were his sisters and brothers. And so, and that there was an emotional impact in those words, and it affected the audience. The same way that perhaps a musician playing a piano on stage or so forth, and he plays with such emotion that even the audience feels the impact of that music. So all the years of practice of that musician are now put into his playing, all the emotion between the notes, how dynamic the music is being played, how loud, how soft, the timing. And he's thinking about all these things, about what this music is expressing, and the audience can't help but to feel that. So the same when someone gives a talk or has their words, their life behind their words, it will have that impact. That just comes out in the words. Because it's not just the words, it's a thought, and everybody is resonating with those same thoughts, because they feel the vibrations of that life behind those words. Another example might be if a man goes to a doctor, and after many tests, the doctor gives him the diagnosis that he has cancer, but then reassures him that that cancer is very curable. But the man is still quite worried. And so the doctor says, "But you will be cured." Now the same man, he goes home, tells his wife, and his children find out about it. And they all reassure him also, "Well, the doctor says you will be fine, you will be cured." But actually it's the words of the doctor that give more reassurance than the words of his wife or his children, because his studies, his experience are all behind the doctor's words. So, but then what about an incompetent doctor? A doctor who claims to be a doctor, or he learned doctoring on the internet. And so he starts giving out advice. And his advice turns out to be wrong. Well, now the person that's going through the treatment is suffering, And the doctor, that so-called doctor, is being sued and now going through suffering. So without a competent teacher or a competent person, then Sri Ramakrishna will describe later that both of these people are suffering now, both the teacher or the doctor and the student or the patient. So now Vijay continues, he says, don't the teachings of the Brahmo Samaj bring men salvation? The Master, how is it ever possible for one man to liberate another from the bondage of the world? God alone, the creator of this world bewitching Maya, can save men from Maya. There is no other refuge but that great teacher, Satchitananda. How is it ever possible for men who have not realized God or received his command, and who are not strengthened with divine strength, to save others from the prison house of the world? One day, as I was passing the Panchavati on my way to the pine grove, I heard a bullfrog croaking. I thought it must have been seized by a snake. After some time, as I was coming back, I could still hear its terrifying croaking. I looked to see what was the matter, and found that a water snake had seized it. The snake could neither swallow it nor give it up. So there was no end to the frog's suffering. I thought that had it been seized by a cobra, it would have been silenced after 3 croaks at the most. As it was, only a water snake. Both of them had to go through this agony. A man's ego is destroyed after 3 croaks, as it were, if he gets into the clutches of a real teacher. But if the teacher is then in quotes, an unripe one, then both the teacher and the disciple undergo endless suffering. The disciple cannot get rid either of his ego or of the shackles of the world. And if the disciple falls into the clutches of an incompetent teacher, he doesn't attain liberation. So here, Sri Ramakrishna is speaking about, he's bringing up the word ego and Maya. So he uses, and then in quotes he says, but if the teacher is an unripe one, then both the teacher and the disciple undergo endless suffering. Throughout the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna brings up this term, the unripe ego and the ripe ego. And he says the unripe ego, which is the ego that makes one attached to this world and you might say, well, he's a teacher, but he's also earning money, and with that money, he's enjoying the world. So he has an ulterior motive for being a teacher or doctor or any discipline like that. So without that ripe ego, the ripe ego is one where the ego is free of selfishness, free of, I'll explain later, is free of attachment to this world. So there is no, he's not doing anything for an ulterior motive in the worldly sense. So one who is incompetent, he's doing this profession for the purpose of earning money or to impress or for some other reason. But his teachings won't be able to give one liberation because he has no spiritual experience. He is not real. His words and actions, his thoughts are, I need to make money, provide for my family. That's what he's thinking about, but he's just reading from the scriptures, word verbatim, and that's it. there's nothing behind those words he's reading other than taking care of his own needs. And with that kind of teacher, the student will not attain liberation. And if you have such a teacher in school, you will not be well educated either. So now Vijay is asking, Sir, why are we bound like this? Why don't we see God? Master, Maya is nothing but the egotism of the embodied soul. This egotism has covered everything like a veil. All troubles come to an end when the ego dies. If by the grace of God a man but once realizes that he is not the doer, then he at once becomes a Jivan Mukta. Though living in the body, he is liberated, and he has nothing else to fear. So, a Jivan Mukta is defined as one who has realized God, who is liberated, but he continues to retain the body in order to serve God. But it says, if by the grace of God a man but once realizes that he is not the doer, in other words, that God is the doer of everything, then he at once becomes a Jivan Mukta. That's a whole spiritual life in one sentence, which most people will never attain. So basically, that's a very, very brief analysis of how to attain God and what happens. But then he says, this Maya, that is to say, the ego, is like a cloud. The sun cannot be seen on account of a thin patch of cloud. When that disappears, one sees the sun. If by the grace of the Guru one's ego vanishes, then one sees God. So at present, we are identified with this finite world, and we don't see God. One who sees God, is identified with God, cannot see this world. In the case of Sri Ramakrishna, he was at that borderline between the two, and he could at will see one or the other more dominantly than the other at various times. In samadhi, he would be completely unaware of this world, but when he's in bhava samadhi, he is in a slightly lower plane, and he sees God in everything. But he still sees the objects, but he understands and perceives that God alone has taken all these forms. So, but generally, one cannot be aware of both at the same time. It's like saying, can one worship Mammon and God together? If one is aware of this world, but still thinks that God is in this world intellectually, that is not an experience, because at any time something might shake that experience, that knowledge. A disaster, for example, suddenly you're worried about saving your life, or the life of your family, or your possessions. Where is God going to come then? You're thinking about saving yourself. And sometimes Swami Nikhilananda gives the example of a frog. It might give its normal sound when it's not under stress or attack, but then once it's grabbed by a snake, it gives one loud croak, and it's the end of its life. It's not thinking that life's all happy and everything. It's just once your beliefs are attacked, you might not be able to sustain an intellectual understanding of God. That's why spiritual practice is necessary, to have the experience so that it can sustain you through all kinds of turmoil and suffering. Then he says that this Maya, and then says this Maya, that is to say, the ego, is like a cloud. So here we use it, there's an analogy where all individual beings are like mirrors. And God, the Son, is a reflection in all those mirrors. Those mirrors may be dirtier than others, some will be cleaner, but the degree of light that's the degree and intensity of the sun in each of those mirrors varies depending on how dirty that mirror is. That dirtiness can be attributed to how strong our egos are, our attachment to the world. Here, and you can also imagine, well, like in Seattle, the sky is often cloudy. Sometimes you see just the image of a sun behind the clouds. Sometimes you won't see the sun at all. But then when the clouds move, then the sun shines in all its glory. So those clouds are all our different attachments, things that we identify with. And we identify with everything in the world, whatever our senses perceive. So if all of that dissipates and disappears, then all we can see is the sun. So, and then at some point, that ego is the last remaining thing that still separates us from that sun. So when that ego or that Maya disappears, then we have, well, there is no question of we, only the sun remains. So Sri Ramakrishna has now mentioned an often used example. It says, Rama, who is God himself, was only 2.5 cubits ahead of Lakshmana. But Lakshmana couldn't see him because Sita stood between them. Lakshmana may be compared to the jiva, the individual soul, and Sita to Maya. So if you can imagine 3 people walking in a row, Rama's in the front, Sita's in the middle, and Lakshmana, his brother, is behind them. He cannot see God or Rama because Sita is in the way. And they are basically in single file, one after the other, so they're close proximity. So that's like the individual soul is unable to see God, which is very close, but just covered by, in this case, Sita's is compared to being like Maya. We cannot see God because of Maya is in the way. So man cannot see God on account of the barrier of Maya. And then Sri Ramakrishna does something. He says, just look, I am creating a barrier in front of my face with this towel. Now you can't see me, even though I am so near. Likewise, God is the nearest of all, but we cannot see him on account of this covering of Maya. And now he continues in more detail. The jiva, or the individual soul, is nothing but the embodiment of Satchitananda. So Satchitananda is described as existence, knowledge, and bliss absolute. It's the ultimate reality that somehow is taken on the form of a jiva, the individual soul. But since Maya or ego has created various upadhis, he has forgotten his real self. So this term upadhis is a philosophical term used in Vedanta. It's in philosophical language it would be called a limited adjunct. It's an apparent limitation that's put on a object. So sometimes an analogy is used of a clear crystal. If I put a red rose behind that crystal, then you would say that that crystal is red. You may not see the red rose, but you will see a red crystal. But that crystal, that redness, is never a part of that crystal. It apparently looks that way from an observer's standpoint. So you would say that redness is an upadi of the crystal. So the jiva itself is pure, like Brahman, but now once the ego has become attached to it, it has acquired this redness, for example. So something, that ego is that, like that rose. It has that red rose. The crystal has attained that redness. That is the ego on the jiva. But now it gets involved with Maya, which now, when the ego is attached, it starts to think, well, I am this, I am that. I want this, I want that. And so now all these things start attaching itself, but they are attaching itself to the ego, not to the crystal. So we say, Sri Ramakrishna is saying that but since Maya or the ego has created various upadis, he has forgotten his real self. So he might be thinking, oh, I'm a millionaire, or I'm a boss, or I'm a father, a mother. It's going to be, I am a human being, I am all these things. I want this, I want that. So he starts acquiring all these things, forgetting his true nature. So all these things start becoming visible within that, say, that crystal. If you observed it, and you say brought a golden ball, you would see a little goldness on top of that reddish ego, that redness, and you would say, well, that's let's say that crystal is red with a little bit of gold, or this or that. So you would then say, well, that's an ego that has desires for name, fame, power, position, money, God knows what. It wants all these things, and it has lost its identity with its true nature. So Sri Ramakrishna continues, and he says, each upadi changes man's nature. So now the ego is affected by all these different upadis. These upadis, as I mentioned, they are limiting adjuncts, they are limitations imposed on the self that prevent the self from recognizing its true nature. And that is what Maya is doing, and Maya and the ego, here he is saying that they are one and the same. So each upadi changes man's nature. If he wears a fine black bordered cloth, you will at once find him humming Nidhu Babu's love songs. And then playing cards and a walking stick will follow. Even if a sickly man put on high boots, he begins to whistle and climbs the stairs like an Englishman, jumping from one step to another. So yes, we acquire something and then we think, oh, we are great, and we feel happy and joyful, and we start bouncing around, and we want more things, we want more happiness, so we get more and more. And if a man but holds a pen in his hand, he scribbles on any paper he can get hold of. Such is the power of the pen. He becomes an author, he becomes famous, God knows what you can do with the pen and with words. But then he also says that money is also a great upadi. The possession of money makes such a difference in a man. He is no longer the same person. a Brahmin, used to frequent the temple garden. Outwardly, he was very modest. One day I went to Kanagar with Hridoy. No sooner did we get off the boat than we noticed the Brahmin sitting on the bank of the Ganges. We thought he had been enjoying the fresh air. Looking at us, he said, "Hello there, priest. How do you do?" I marked his tone and said to Hridoy, "The man must have got some money. That's why he talks that way." And Hridoy laughed. And then it gives a little short story here. A frog had a rupee, which he kept in his hole. One day an elephant was going over the hole, and the frog, coming out in a fit of anger, raised his foot as if to kick the elephant, and said, "How dare you walk over my head?" Such is the pride that money begets. So all these things attach us to the world. But they attach us to the world, and Sri Ramakrishna would call this the unripe ego. But then he would start talking about, well, what is the ripe ego? Well, the ripe ego is when you start thinking that I am the servant of God, or I am a devotee of God, or I am a child of God. Those attitudes of ego will not attach one to the world. In fact, they will free you from the world and help, and then your upadhis will drop off because you no longer need them to sustain yourself or to sustain your ego until finally the ego itself drops off. That redness drops off from the crystal, for example, and only the jiva remains. And then at that point, it no longer can identify itself as a jiva or a soul. It can only, all that remains is God. So, as we continue, Sri Ramakrishna will talk more on this ripe ego. So I will conclude there today. And if you have any questions, you can think about them while I give you a few announcements. Tomorrow evening at 7 p.m., Swami Brahmatmananda will be continuing with a class on Towards the Goal Supreme. And on this coming Friday, Swami Satyamananda will be giving the final part of class on Gorima. And on Saturday, we will be celebrating Durga Puja here in the chapel. Seating is limited, parking is limited to the neighborhood, and so you should come early to reserve a spot. If we have too many people, I'm not sure how we will manage that, but we'll see what happens. The puja will be at 11 a.m. It will be streamed live also. So, but you won't have the benefit of getting prasad. So if you want prasad and also pushpanjali afterwards, the peace water offering, you'll have to be here in person. And also, there is no Sunday lecture this weekend because of the Durga Puja. That will be a 2-hour event. So there are no questions online. I don't know about in person here. Don't see any hands up at the moment. So I will conclude with a chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Ritavigraham Vai Ishavataram Paramesamityam Tvam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha. We salute that Ramakrishna, who is without blemish, eternal and infinite in forms, who has assumed human form out of compassion for the devotees, who is God incarnate, the Supreme Lord, and who is most worshipful. Om, peace, peace, peace to all beings.